Good morning and welcome to the April 29, 2014 special meeting of Glendale City Council. May we have roll call, please?
Council members: Friedman. Here. Najarian.
Here.
Montero.
Here.
Weaver.
Here.
Mayor Sinanian.
Here. What's next on the agenda?
The agenda for the April 29, 2014 special public meeting of the City Council was posted on Thursday, April 24th, 2014 on the bulletin board outside City Hall. Before you today is the Director of Administrative Services Finance regarding budget study session fiscal year 2013-14, third quarter update, and year-end financial projection. Fiscal year 2013-14 proposed budget adjustments, fiscal year 2014-15 proposed general fund budget, general fund forecast, organizational profile, budget calendar. At A is a motion to note and file report. B is a resolution appropriating $340,000 to fund third quarter budget adjustments to the originally adopted fiscal year 2013-14 budget.
Yes.
Yes, sir. We have this inaugural budget study session that we will provide, as City Clerk indicated, a good deal of information to close out the current fiscal year and to set the edge of the discussions for your upcoming budget study sessions as we approach the 14-15 fiscal year. So with that, we'll jump in because there's a lot of information. Please feel free to stop anytime you want to get into some of the detail, because there is a lot of detail here. And as I say, this really is not the meat of next year's budget. We'll conclude with a bit of some foreshadowing of what this year's budget will entail by way of departmental programs. But this will really focus on the organization as it stands today and as we close out the current fiscal year. So we'll look at the current year, the coming year, and then, of course, have opportunity for questions, comments, and direction from council. So with that, Bob will take you through the third quarter update. Bob?
Thank you, Scott. Mr. Mayor, members of the council, third quarter update, as we often do through the quarterly updates, we take a look at the general fund revenues and the general fund expenditures. Our revenues at this point in time are $92.9 million, slightly above last year, about where we expected them to be. We have a little bit of increase in property and sales tax, and I'll show you those adjustments as we walk through the data. So you can see here our original adopted budget in the far left column and the adjustments that we have added to it throughout the year. License and permits are up, and you'll see that as we move forward in 14-15, although they're not as high as we have adjusted them up for 13-14. That's primarily due to all the building that has occurred this year. So again, at this point in time, we're where we want to be in terms of revenues for the general fund. In terms of expenditures, straight line, we would be 75%. We're well below that at about 72% for the third quarter, which is good. And we're actually a little bit higher than last year, but all the departments at this point are below the 75%. You can see the total at 72. All the other respective departments are below the 75% for the fiscal year.
So does that, sorry to interrupt, does that mean that ultimately they will catch up to the 100%, or does that mean that we may fall below what was expected to be expended?
Yeah, I'll show you what that forecasts out to. Typically, there's a little bit more spending towards the fourth quarter of the budget year, so the fact that this is below 75 is good. It ebbs up a little bit in the fourth quarter, but I'll show you what our projection gets us to. Our current cash balances, as we always show, in the total of $474 million. I will note that in the both electric and water fund, we have unspent bond proceeds. In electric fund, about $57 million here, and in the water fund, about $25 million unspent bond proceeds. As you have noted and have heard, the water fund still has negative cash of $14.6 million. Relative to all the other funds, the total operating cash is about $390 million in the citywide pool. So where does that get us to for fiscal year end? As I noted earlier, what the expenditures are, we're forecasting our revenues at $170.7. All our salaries and benefits and M&O, you can see the variances. We do have salary savings of about 2.7, at least as we're projecting. M&O savings of about 1.7. with our expenditure totals. So that'll give us, we're forecasting about an $800,000 surplus moving into the end of the year. So what would that do to ultimately to our fund balance? It would give us a little bit of increase relative to where we were and bring us to about a 35.8% fund balance between the charter reserve and the...
Question, does that amount take into consideration the 1.2 million extra in licenses and fees? I mean, can you go to the slide before that? See so what does that mean? We've got the revised budget, which incorporates those extra.
Correct.
And then the forecast, how far ahead are we forecasting?
Forecast is through the end of the year, so that's where we expect our revenues to end up. So that's our adopted or revised budget for revenues. And this breaks down a revised budget for expenditures. So with additional appropriations and use of fund balance, we have spending authority of $175 million.
We had a big project that we approved last week, and one of the resounding statements that we kept hearing by the developer is, we're giving you guys $4 million in permits, fees, and licensing. They obviously had not pulled them yet, and I suspect that they would pull them in the next few months before a new council comes in and maybe monkeys around with their entitlements, regardless of whether they're locked in or not. So wouldn't we include, permit fees and all that other stuff between now and July?
We have updated. Let me go back. We have increased licenses and permits by $1.2 million for this year, and Armin Harkalian, our revenue manager, keeps in close contact with the building division in terms of what their permit levels are throughout the year. So whether they pull it or not, we'll recognize that if they do, and we'll have an additional surplus towards the end of the year. If they do, if not, it'll push into next year.
I would say there'd be
if they can't,
the way the political winds are blowing, I mean, all the candidates that are ready to take Mr. Quintero's seat have expressed some level of reduction in building. And so logically, those that are on the cusp or are ready to pull those permits would not wait around, and they do it in the next few months, before the results are tallied. So I would, if that comes to pass, and there's that extra, maybe up to $1 million or more, where does that go?
that will make this number bigger. And we'll just add to the projected fund balance. As it is, we meet our target level of 35% reserve. Again, our floor is 30%, council adopted floor of reserve, and our target is 35. So any addition to that 800,000 here would push our total projected ending fund balance higher.
As well as prepaying, what we offer a prepayment for some park fees and all that before they. Where's Hassan? There's a developer can prepay, can they not, certain fees and expenses before the higher rates kick in. So I would expect to see a larger surplus than that.
Some developers got a development agreement to prepay, and then if you remember, you passed a new parks and libraries fees that. So all it did is that if they are having a complete application by a certain date, they will be subject to the old parks impact fees. But there's no requirement for them to prepay. Some of them are telling us that they will prepay, but they haven't even started their building permit process yet.
That's the way I'm thinking. So they haven't. They'd like to prepay, but it takes some effort to get to that stage where they're eligible to. Thank you.
So the last thing we have for you on the third quarter is the need to appropriate an additional $340,000 to hold the special election, and that would be in addition to the city clerk's budget for the 13-14 fiscal year. That's the only action item that we have before you. And with that, I'll turn it back to Scott for the organizational profile.
As the council has, I'm sure, gotten used to seeing the way that we keep score and we keep a track of different indicators that tell us little bits and pieces about our organization and use them as a mosaic to get an overall picture of how we are executing, how we're performing. Let me walk you through some of these slides that I'm sure you've seen before. In terms of total population, you see what the increase is pursuant to the information from Department of Finance. We are increasing in size ever so slightly. The total population at 1588, and then the general fund FTE at 905, again, lowest that we've been in many, many, many years. When you look at the total adopted budget, the increase from last year to this current year, largely a function of the capital programs in our enterprise funds. And then the general fund appropriation, again, much more stable, increasing much less from 165 to 170. Residents served per FTE, the full-time equivalent employees, you're saying that we're serving more people with fewer employees. And the general fund is a little bit different than that because we have shifted people around from general fund to enterprise funds. The interesting thing here in terms of budget per capita, we are increasing as the budget is increased, but you see greater stability again from the general fund budget per capita. When you look at our department, all these indicators alongside our neighbors as we look at the competition that we have for all of our services. Total population across the top, we are the largest of the Tri-City area. Burbank at 104, Pasadena 140,000. In terms of full-time employees budgeted, 1588, 1391, and 2145. That would indicate that, again, all full-service cities, some wrinkles for all of them, no doubt, but generally there's a lot of commonality there. Yet we are doing a tremendous amount of work as a very, very streamlined organization. Even on the general fund, the general fund, we are very streamlined. When you look at total budgets, I look at the general fund adopted budget there at $170 million versus $149 at $202 million. When you look at the number of residents served per FTE, again, 122 residents per employee versus 75 and 65 respectively for Burbank and Pasadena. And look at the general fund, that ratio continues to hold. Budget per capita, 3,800 versus 6,100 and 4,800. These are important indicators. In general fund, you see 882 to the other amounts. I think it demonstrates the good work of the City Council, the fiscal responsibility and diligence to hold the line at all accounts and to reconcile with all of the long-term structural costs that we face. It's bearing out general fund, non-general fund, and when you look at the performance indicators, when we go through all the departments at our next study session, you'll see that we're still delivering a high level of service to our residents. When people continue to talk about debt and debt for cities, I encourage them to actually stop and take a look at the city's CAFR, because when you see the COP certificates of participation for the GPD facility, the revenue bonds from GWP, all of our claims payable, the landfill liability for the closure, absences, I mean those that accrue that are compensated pursuant to our MOUs, the OPEB to date. Up until this point, over the last 6 years that we've had to calculate OPEB, other post-employment benefits, you see that we are carrying $425 million as an organization. But, and when you look at what our liquidity ratios and what our quick ratio is, we still have the ability to pay our bills, the assets over liabilities, 5.5 times over. We are to the good. We can pay those bills 5.5 times over compared to our neighbors. And the quick ratio that basically subtracts the inventory, so it's an even more conservative view of our ability, of our liquidity to make good on all of our obligations, we still dominate over the others. Similarly, when you look at debt ratio, as a function of assets to liabilities, or liabilities to assets rather, we're at 22%. And when you look at compared to 35 and 36%, when you look at debt to equity, really a reflection of the degree to which we use debt as the formation of our capital structure for all of the things that we do and build, you can see we are far less than our neighbors. Meaning that we do much as possible and do a very tremendous job, again, going back to previous councils, to this council, of paying as we go and using debt very, very sparingly. something that the council has held very dear, and it's reflected in the hard numbers, whether some folks like it or not. When we look at our organizational profile for the third quarter, and you see where we were last year, you see what the adopted budget is today, from 19.9%. My pointer's not working. Do we have another one? The public safety as an overall budget, not general fund, but overall budget. 20% of our expenditures are going to public safety. This current year is 18.3. You see public works, utilities, transit. These are all grouped by large major functions. We're spending a good deal of which one is it?
Yeah, this works.
This works. That's a pointer. Sorry. Okay, we're seeing a good deal of expenditure here in terms of the infrastructure, streamlining all of our other operations. As it has come up, as you know, where the cuts have come are on those soft services, those quality of life services, libraries, parks, and all the things that end up falling by the wayside, especially in comparison to public safety and to public works. We saw that borne out in our surveys as we've done them over the last year.
Mr. Ochoa, how do those ratios compare to our neighboring cities?
On the full service side, it's going to be a bit scattered over. You will see consistency on the general fund side. General fund, you'll see that public safety is going to creep up to 2/3 of the budget. That will be similar to everybody else that is a full service city. Burbank, Pasadena, and all the other cities that are not part of the county system. And these generally will hold true. The trend would be quality of life goes down, those services, the soft services go down, the public safety goes up, and where I think we are very different from most is the amount of money we put in each and every year into infrastructure. Okay, when we look again in terms of scorekeeping, where we are here with this, what this slide is intended to show is that the council has set a target of personnel versus operating for all funds, operating costs for all funds. Our target was 35%. We're at 33.3%. That means that we are not just making payroll and lighting the lights. We actually are putting dollars out in the street to improve the community. Further, when you look at total salaries and benefits change from the previous year, those are going down in real terms. And yet our total operating expenditures have crept up. What this means is that our ability to keep personnel down isn't just a float down of the overall diminution of appropriations. We are actually driving down the cost of employment while still putting money out on the street. When you look at the employee count, again, 1,588 down from the previous year, and historic lows by all accounts. When you look at just the general fund, our target was 75%. You see the trend is going the right way, starting in 10-11 at nearly 80%, down to 78.8%. We haven't met the 70% goal, but we are going that right direction. When you look at keeping management streamlined, again, direction, we're meeting the goal at 19%. Our goal is 20%. We are going the right direction in terms of driving that number down. Basically, all we do here is compare the total salaries without the benefit roll-up, because then it gets a little bit complex and confusing between the different MOUs. But looking at total salaries, management versus non-management, and the goal is to keep that at no more than 20%, and we're able to do that. This is what ends up getting us. And this is, for some reason, some folks out there like to think that this is some hidden secret, but in fact, it's something that the City Council has wrestled with over really the last 15 to 20 years. And that is the total cost of employment. So we have up here, you see different years, safety, non-safety, safety, non-safety, from 11, 12, 12, 13, 13, 14. The value, the percentage of the compensation of the benefit load that goes to accrued time, insurances, meaning medical, dental, vision, what have you, our employer costs for disability, for unemployment, the retirement, which is where the lion's share of this is, and then we net that out against the retirement cost share, because all of our employees, to some degree or another, and usually it's a pretty hefty degree, participate in cost sharing to reduce the employer's share of the PERS retirement cost. That said, what you see here is the increasing creep up of the PERS rates and in these areas, and then you see it here as a total percentage. So for every dollar we spend Looking at 13, 14, for every dollar we spend, we're spending 63, it's almost 64 cents as part of that benefit load. That is a lot. There's no two ways about it. It has increased, but PERS, I think, has made tremendous inroads to rectify some of the bad decisions and poor investment choices that they've made, and they are beginning to call things by their right names. What we are seeing, as you'll see in our 5-year financial forecast, is that these numbers ultimately begin to plateau, and through attrition, as folks frankly die off, and through the second-tier benefit that the City Council had the foresight to put in place when it did, the rates, the pressure from the rates begin to ease. As we've talked about before, 1588, people drive, we are a service industry, so people drive our costs, the number of people that we carry. You can take a look back going over the last 10 years, we are at historic lows. We haven't been this low again since, for full-time, approved full-time positions since the early 1990s. Let's talk a bit about the general fund forecast. What goes into this forecast? We look at all of our future challenges, all of our operating costs, ongoing salaries and benefits, and our maintenance and operating costs, our pension costs, what we know and what we can expect over the coming 5 years, and the CIP program. As you know, the council previously, at one point, at the absolute abyss of the recession, we didn't put any of the sales tax revenue that we received into CIP. We now have put in the 1%. The idea is to grow this to a certain threshold and someday even maybe get back and begin to approach the historic levels that the City Council had done in generations past. But that'll be a larger discussion, I think, over the next 10, 20 years. Internal service funds, all the costs that we have, workers' comp, information technology fleet, and then we have to now take into account OPEB, other post-employment benefits. We don't have a retiree medical program like they do in many organizations where retirees leave the organization and then the city continues to pay for their insurance, or at least even a portion of their insurance. What we have is an implied subsidy, meaning that we allow retirees to buy insurance through the city's program, and we blend the rates of actives and retirees. While that is a very Spartan benefit, to be sure, compared to other agencies, and again reflects the historic fiscal conservativeness of the City Council and previous City Councils, it still does generate an OPEB liability, which we now have to calculate, and soon we will have to book on our financial statement. In terms of...
I'm sorry. So that number of 214, what are the components of that?
That is the value of the value that is received by the retirees for the blended, the ability to buy insurance through a blended rate versus saying you are now retired, you're in a wholly separate pool, and you're paying the full freight that comes along with that pool.
And so is that up until age 65 where they're eligible for Medicare, or that would assume their entire lifespan?
That gets you, does that get you all the way to Medicare age or beyond?
It's an actuarially determined liability that includes the cost today for blending retirees, but it also includes the future benefit.
But is it mortality or to 65? I thought it was mortality.
It's for the duration. They're still going to have a blended rate, but their rates will reduce once they get on Medicare. They're still, what is it, Medicare Part D or whatever they get on to at 65. But it's really that core time between early retirees and then the time that they get to Medicare.
So on an individual basis, generally speaking, what sort of benefit does that endorse?
Well, hypothetically, I mean, it's the analogy is if we blend all the insurance, it would be as if you're a good driver and your neighbor's a bad driver, and you just blend the rates and you pay higher and your neighbor pays lower. Basically that same analogy. The actives are paying more now, retirees are paying less, but there is a subsidy that is generated to the retirees for doing that. There's also a future benefit for current employees that will have that benefit out in the future, and it's actuarially determined at this point at $214 million.
As opposed to the $57 million that you saw previously, which gets us just to this point in time.
Okay, but also, as we have been doing for the past several years with our employee groups, we've been asking them to pick up a portion of the increase. So does that factors in some cases it's up to 50% of the increase?
Correct.
So that's cutting that part out.
There is an assumption based off the increase in the medical rates versus what the blending components are. We get that information from our broker, we give it to our actuary, they run the numbers, and that's unfortunately the liability as it is as of last week or 2 weeks ago when we got the report. It's a big number.
It's a big number. I'm surprised that it's that high.
When you look at the revenue assumptions, back to your other question, Mr. Nazarian, we look at all of our pipeline projects. The CDD folks have a list if the council would care to peruse it. Everything that you have seen or that we have heard about or talked about as they come in, not just for this current year, but as we think that they will come in regardless of when they are viewed by council, but really for this exercise, when we think that they will pull permits, when we think that those dollars will flow for the construction of the project, and then once we think that the revenues, be they a commercial project that may generate some sales tax or a residential project that will generate only property tax, when we think in which fiscal year those will come. We also anticipate no voter-approved revenue enhancements pursuant to the survey that was done earlier this year, and it does very notably does not include any new sales tax above a straight line assessment of a historic curve of what we have experienced in the past. So if we were to pull a new auto dealership that would have a pretty significant blip on our radar, that is not included here. The purposes of our general fund growth is basically on revenue is 2.4%. That's the amalgam of all of these other elements of the general fund. And so you know what this looks like in terms of the general fund. As you see, property taxes are our largest single chunk at $45 million. Sales taxes next at almost $33 million. Utility user tax, 27.6. Transfers, notably the GWP transfer, 20 of the 23, 657,000. And the inter-service funds, licenses, permits, fees, other revenues. Conversely, almost exactly, police and fire, as I said previously, in any full-service city, police and fire are going to take up 2/3 of that general fund. We are a little less than 2/3. That's a credit to all of the diversification of the funding that we have for special grants and opportunities that the departments pursue respectively. But you can see almost straight across what the impacts of reducing the utility user tax, which is being challenged at this point in time. Folks have submitted signatures. What that would do, what programs would have to be removed, and I don't mean programs, I mean departments, would have to be removed in order to accommodate that. To the extent that even if you did lose the utility user tax and said, we will cut libraries, arts, and culture, my guess is that this council and certainly the community would not hope to have the entire library system removed. But even if you did, and we were going to go to the county library library system, that still comes with a cost. The county libraries are not going to operate libraries for free, or even if we said we'll keep Central open, but we'll close every branch, including Brand, then we could drive this number down, $3 million perhaps. If we were going to get rid of all of our parks, or at least eliminate all the programming in our parks, all of our social service programs that are not CDBG funded, my point being that you still would have a hard time closing this $27 million gap unless you were willing to wholesale get rid of these improvements. What is more likely to happen is that if you were to lose the $27 million, is you would have to be forced to either look at contracting out police and or likely both police and fire to the County of Los Angeles or neighboring agencies. Because both police and fire, whether you contracted them with Burbank or Pasadena or Los Angeles or LA County, they still are going to charge you for that cost, and they have all the same cost pressures that we do.
Storcho, when did the UTT come online?
That was in 1969, I believe, and it was reaffirmed in 2009 at the lower current rates.
So even before 2009, UTT was...
Yes, sir. It's been long-standing.
And before we talk about I'm sorry.
I was going to say, you mentioned contracting with the county that, of course, you're going to be charged, and I might add, I seriously doubt you're going to be given the same level of service, whether it's police, fire, et cetera. Just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, response.
Mr. Najarian?
Yes. And directly along those lines, it's one thing to talk about the cost pressures that the sheriffs and the county fire have, similar to ours, but as Councilman Quintero said, the sheriffs are not going to provide anywhere near the level of service or be anywhere as near as receptive to the community needs. And I know that firsthand because the Sheriff's Department handles the MTA security, and we can't get them to, move an aggressive, mentally disturbed homeless person out of Union Station. And they're very standoffish, and you've got to go up the chain of command and back down the chain of command. So whoever came up with that idea to contract out with the sheriffs and the county fire, may only be looking at a bottom line that is illusory at best when it comes down to the services that our residents demand and expect. I don't think they can come close to our police and fire.
To say nothing of the learning curve. I mean, starting with fire, I think every fire station and captain and all the rest of the chiefs know exactly what apartment buildings, what they're like, the inspections that take place. They've got the city down pat to bring in a force from the outside. It's not even feasible as far as I'm concerned.
And just for the record, I believe my wife and I voted for the utility user tax in 1969.
I think that's right. It was 69.
Yep.
So the follow-up question to my initial one, from 2008 until now, about 5.5 years, we've cut our workforce by approximately 400 employees.
Thereabouts.
I'm just wondering, how did the city fund itself in 2008 with 400 extra mouths to feed? And in essence, our services haven't suffered significantly. I mean, we're still providing pretty much the level. Yes, we have eliminated a lot of the safety officers at schools, but we're not. I mean, we haven't really scaled back in a massive way our services. So how did the city do it? Where is the discrepancy in terms of revenues coming into the city in 2007? So before 2008 versus now?
I think there's two things that come into play. At least two things that come into play. Three things, I'm sorry. The first and foremost is I think it was T.S. Eliot that said that one never knows how far one can go until one is willing to risk going too far. And so to the extent that we had done business a certain way for a very long time, it wasn't until confronted with the absolute existential threat of losing as much revenue as we did that we realized that we could be a little more streamlined, considerably more streamlined. And coupled with an accelerant of technology and the need to do more regionally and to do more with the community, that made up a good deal of the service demand. Further, the City Council reprioritized a great deal as to what was most important and what could fall by the wayside. And so I think those things certainly contribute to that equation. The third thing is, frankly, PERS. Our PERS cost, as everyone's PERS cost, as they are making up for the hits of the Great Recession, the bad decisions that they had made, are being passed on to the member agencies. And so as you look at our resources get back to pre-recessionary levels, and our employees have not had COLA, cost of living increases, since 2008, where has that money gone? That money has effectively gone to PERS. Again, not something that we have not discussed or disclosed. In fact, over the last two budget cycles, that's been a central theme of what we've done or what we've talked about. But that's basically where it goes.
The redevelopment.
The redevelopment hurts because the idea of us being able to go out and grow new money has been taken from us. Now, it's ironic, and you'll see in the 5-year forecast, in our worst case scenarios heading forward, foreseeable worst case scenarios, we'll be running deficits for a short period of time we're projected to show deficits of $5.5 million. Ironically enough, the $124 million that the state of California stole and it was theft, going back to 1992-93 with ERAF, where the state literally just took money away, property tax monies from cities, and took them and then ended up using them on education. That runs about $5.5 to $6 million a year today. We have yet to receive a thank you note from the state in any way, shape, or form. But it's those three pressures, technology, reprioritization, and PERS really make up the story of what has been done in the interim. So we do talk about salaries. We still maintain step increases under our merit step program at $800,000 fully loaded. We do have one scheduled COLA for GFFA. That was an agreement that was negotiated prior to the onset of the recession that GFFA had deferred again and again and again very graciously. They did take it this past year, and there's one more due in 15-16. That is included in the 5-year financial forecast. We did get relatively good news on medical benefits with this is a relative term, a good only 10% annual increase, but we are presuming that, as Mr. Najarian had pointed out, 50% cost share with employee groups. As we've said, PERS is a major cost driver, and our goal here is to look at total compensation, all the elements of compensation. So what do we know about compensation? Well, salaries is the first element of that. That makes up about 60% of our total comp equation goes towards salaries. Again, we are a service industry. The cost of the people is what drives our costs. So we have to stay competitive in the market if, in fact, we are having fewer people do more and have to have a greater skill set. So we look at a comparison with the market, 10 cities and us. And what we have found is that GCA, GMA, IBW executives who have gone without salary increases since 2008, they are actually well below what that average is, that market average. GPOA, who has not had a COLA since 2011, and GFFA, as I had mentioned earlier, had negotiated COLAs. They hover around the market average, which is good, especially considering they generate about 2/3 of the cost of the general fund appropriation. All employees, as I said, do participate in some kind of offset between salary and pension costs. In terms of benefits, we, through our HR department, have been very aggressive in pricing those with our brokers. The question is what is it going to last? We have accepted, and I think our employee associations, we would gratefully and graciously acknowledge that they too have appeared to accept that 50% cost share is the new normal, and that has played a role in containing what the medical, in particular, medical cost increases are. The impact of healthcare reform is something that we are very much focused on. There seems to be some argument and trend that as more people have health insurance, they will use it more because they've never had it before, and until that is normalized, that impact of how best to manage your health and wellness is truly understood by all, that we will see an increase in the demand for health care that could translate into an increase in the cost for health care for both currents and employees and retirees. Interesting to note, 26% of our compensation equation owes to the medical. With respect to PERS, they're approaching historic highs, and we'll show you what that means, but we do expect them to plateau in those out years, in year 6 and year 7, as the board makes up for that lost time. The notion of cost containment, I think, again, City Council has done an outstanding job in the near term, working with our employee groups to do cost sharing in a manner that far exceeds most cities in the state, if not the region. And when you look at long term, the 2-term benefit structure, and certainly the state finally got with the act, and they adopted the Public Employee Pension Reform Act, which is almost as comprehensive and strict as what City Council here in Glendale did prior, well before the state got on the ball. But we still have that OPEB liability, that implied subsidy. It's important to note it is not a retiree medical program such that has killed cities like Stockton and other cities that offered that benefit, could not afford it, and ultimately are looking at dire straits. 14%, it's interesting because we talk a lot about at PERS, but overall it's 14% of our cost equation. So here's the forecast. No further ado. Oh, I'm sorry, these are our PERS rates. We won't get to the forecast just yet. You can see here of 13-14, the safety rate goes from almost 32% up to 52.65%. a very steady increase. But I think this is the noteworthy part, is in those out years from 1920 to 2021, we do begin to plateau. We had expected that dynamic to exist here from 1617 to 1819. But as you know, a couple of months ago, PERS hopefully instituted the last of their rate shocks by accounting for the longevity of retirees, the fact that people are simply living longer. They have applied that, and basically that window of plateau moved from the 1617 out to the 1920 and forward. That's good. The question for us is, can we make it there? Because these increases are indeed substantial. Then you have the miscellaneous. They follow the same kind of trend where you see the plateau existing out here, deferred several years by the PERS increase for actuarial. The takeaway here is that because of the cost sharing that we have with our employees, by the final year, that cost share will save us almost $3 million per year. Today, it's about $2.3 million a year, but it will grow, and we do believe that the cost share is something that will remain in effect at its current levels, forming a new floor for our compensation equation. This is an interesting chart because it shows you where some cities have gotten into trouble and where Glendale has been able to weather the storm. Our 10-year average of PERS rates is 9.1, and the reason, one of the reasons why it's this low is because if you recall in 2000, 2001, 2002, we were superfunded. PERS was superfunded. Our rates were zero, and as they ramped out of that zero, that drug the rate down. So the average over these last 10 years, 9.1. I would argue that 10%, and I think most leading edge organizations would argue that 10% is probably the lowest that we would be for some time to come, even with all of the reforms that have been put in place. The danger zone, where those Stocktons and San Bernardinos and Vallejos are all come from, is when this number starts to eclipse 20%. Well, you can see here as we steadily increase, as we go through the PERS actuarials, and ultimately we plateau here at 2021, 22, we're still at 16.6. A hefty fee to be sure, a hefty amount to be sure, but certainly not in that danger zone. And again, this is at the plateau level, not at the climb level. That again is a tribute back to the tight-fisted nature of this and previous city councils, that the PERS offerings have always been relatively Spartan compared to the rest of the industry. So what do those PERS rates look like? Well, here we are, the 39-year average, while 22.7 for safety, almost 12% for non-safety. We today, at 2014, are at 31.79 and 16.18. The highest that we have record of, we go back to 1981. We've been in this, the system has been in this condition before. However, it's worth noting that as we go forward into the next several years, we will be somewhat in uncharted territory, higher than even those higher years in the early and mid-1980s. So that begs the question, can we separate from PERS? Some folks like to talk about that. Why don't you just get out of PERS? Easier said than done, as the saying goes. For every complex, multifaceted, convoluted problem, there's a very simple, very straightforward, and very wrong answer. So to the extent that we have PERS embedded in the charter, that would take a charter amendment, but presume even that you could get that charter amendment by stoking the resentment and anger of voters. Well, our unfunded liability is $238 million. That gets thrown around a great deal as well. But that means that $238 million represents the 16% of our pension obligation that is not funded. Contrary to what has been thrown around in the press recently, we are 84% funded, not 84% unfunded, well in excess of what the averages are. So at $238 million, this represents the promise made to all current and past employees. They all walked out the door at this point in time. If you were to discount that back the way PERS would in the event of a divorce settlement effectively, that 238 becomes $578 million, which, by the way, they would want on their terms. So the long story short is that you probably are not fiscally going to be able to separate yourself at this point in time from PERS, given what these numbers are now. And even for those folks who would say, well, let's declare bankruptcy. I think that Stockton, San Bernardino, Vallejo also form interesting case studies about whether or not they will be able to walk away from those obligations as opposed to private obligations. A story for a different day, perhaps, but the idea being that, again, nothing is ever going to be easy and without any significant consequence. Further, as an organization, as a business entity in this business of government, we would be at a significant disadvantage in the labor market because we would be without that pension offering, particularly to our public safety employees where there is no private sector comparable, and recognizing that public safety is 2/3 of the general fund where most of the pressure is placed on this PERS obligation. Further, when you consider that if you did go to a private model, even if you're paying the payroll tax, and knowing that you'll have to put something into some kind of 401k, the idea being that you would end up increasing what your salaries are to make up for the difference in that total compensation equation, salary plus benefit plus pension in this particular model. If we focus on that final number, the total compensation number, however we adjust the variables that make up that equation, it really starts to dilute this argument as nothing more than something that sounds good when you're trying to stoke anger. Let's also talk about what PERS means in terms of some of the discussions of what it is and what it isn't by way of the pensioners. We have 2,039 City of Glendale pensioners. The highest pension right now is $211,151. The lowest pension is $336. Must have been a city council member at some point who worked simply for the love of Glendale. You have the average pension at $38 and the median pension, meaning that this would account for the very high and the very low. The median is $28,017. A far cry from what some folks would have you believe. Now, some folks will look at this and say, wait a second, there are people who I know are getting a pension higher than $211,000. True enough, but again, you have to understand how the system works. This represents the pensions that you see that Glendale is responsible for. Those pensions are allocated across all of the agencies that employees had worked for. So I worked for the City of Monrovia for 19 years. A very significant portion of the pension that I would hope to receive is going to be paid for by the City of Monrovia as well as the City of Glendale. The aggregate amount may be in this area or maybe a little bit higher depending on which former employees we're talking about, but the amount that Glendale is responsible for is well lower than that. So when you look at the average safety pension, so one more bit of clarification, what you see here is an individual who spent their entire 38-year career in Glendale. If you think of former executives who are in that same range in terms of what their total pension is, Glendale is probably paying a portion of that, a half of that, a third of that, or some other level based on where they also worked and for how long they worked in those other agencies. So the average safety pension is almost $53,000. The average miscellaneous pension is almost $28,000. So again, total compensation equation: 60% is salary, 26% is benefits, 14% is retirement, and while still a very high amount, it still is something that is, as a percentage of pay, and just a singular element, not the dominating element of that compensation equation. When you look at, okay, we know all this, but how do we then, and going to Mayor Sinanian's question, how do we sustain the value proposition? Well, as I said, we focus on the priorities. As you know, in our citizen satisfaction survey, the vast majority of our residents believe the city council is on the right track. The vast majority of our residents say that 73% of our residents believe that we are, on a scale of 1 to 10, 10 being the highest, 73% that we are an 8 or better. That is a high level of satisfaction with the services that we provide, and for the city council as policymakers, I would argue it's your job to make sure that we as staff don't venture away from those things that make our residents and customers and businesses the happiest, to have the discipline to stay focused on those core functions. At the same time, in terms of investing strategically in the organization, we're talking about realizing what are long-term versus short-term outcomes. As Mr. Najarian had indicated, some folks who may argue, for example, to contract out, even temporarily, if that were possible, police and fire, Well, you're going to cut off the head to cure the headache. We've been in business here for well more than a century. My guess is we'll be here for another century. The idea is that we have to realize what is it that we want to be as an organization, what are the services that our residents want, what do they value, and then how do we deliver them in the best, most cost-effective way possible. That means that we have to maintain our perspective and steer clear of the distractions, and recognizing that it is the election season, the distractions are manifold. But at the same time, I think it's our job as your staff to try to distill some of that to make sure that as you make policy, you make it in the clearest sense possible. We do more with less, as Mr. Snanian indicated, the role of technology, outsourcing, and network collaboration. Outsourcing more, doing less as city employees, and working with our community partners, with the nonprofit organizations, with the business community where possible, with other public agencies. You see that in our public safety offerings. We've gotten to a point now where firefighting, for example, is almost a regional exercise, and Glendale, certainly under the leadership of Chief Scoggins, is leading the way there. And in order to make all this happen, we have to have the best employees, people that just don't do one thing very well, but that do many things very well. Our view of this is the concept of that five-tool player, that employee who is a leader, a thinker, a public servant, a communicator, and an operator who knows every aspect of the operation, who we can drop them in effectively behind enemy lines, and they can perform the job because they know how it gets done, they know what the expectations and values are. And it also means that we are focused on our comprehensive compensation strategy. Again, people drive our business. The cost for those people is the biggest element of our cost, and so the idea that we have to know what we pay and why we pay and how we pay and how we reward the doers, that is all very central to this equation.
Mr. Ochoa, we have met the enemy.
The enemy is us? Indeed we have, sir. But to the extent that you have wrestled with that enemy and made sure that we have and adhere to these principles of compensation management that the council has previously adopted, you've seen this and know this before, but the idea that we deal with things as they are and accept what those brutal facts are, and most notably that we shall pay average market salaries but expect exceptional execution and performance. People will come to Glendale to work here because it's a progressive organization that is well led by the city council. The idea, though, is that if we are going to say make this value proposition to the employees, then we need to get to that average and stay there, but not venture above it.
Where does this language come from?
This was in our budget process last year. So the idea here is, you see the highlighted from the year before? We're focused. We want good quality and personnel. We want the best that we can possibly afford. Compensation must be funded and secured, so we just don't put our finger in the air and hope that it's all going to come out well in the end based on the prevailing winds. We do calibrate compensation for classifications at the average of those comparable cities that we are competing for. We look at the internal organizational equity to make sure that the right people are doing the right job at the right classification for the right pay, because we have so slimmed down the number of employees. It isn't as though we're this mammoth bureaucracy that has the ability to put all of the underperformers in one location so that they don't harm themselves. That would be actually would be the state of California, in all honesty. When you look at all of our other assumptions and what all of our other principles are, you see those same types of real-world, hard, fact-based types of beliefs about the way that we will compensate our employees. You see here, the management shall not exceed 25% of the personnel costs. We, as you know, have driven that down to 19%. We're aspiring to keep that below 20%. All these things set the profile of who we are, how we are. When we look at workers' comp insurance, we know that we have to do a better job here, that the numbers of claims and the amount per claim is continuing to hold steady and not go down. This is a challenge for us. We know that we have a deficit of $16.8 million in that fund, and that over the coming several years, our goal is to erase that deficit by allocating more money in the budget to workers' comp. Fleet replacement, previously we had kicked the can down the road there, but at this point we are looking at 13% annual increases through 18-19. That does not get us everything that we want by way of the replacement of vehicles, but it does get us enough where we are responsible and we can make sure that we meet the needs of the organization and thus the community. We will have fully funded, bless you, we will have fully funded programs by 1819 in this arena, but again, scaled back to what the core missions are. Information services infrastructure, in all honesty, we have not done as good a job here over the last 20 years as we should have in terms of being that progressive leading edge city. We, at this point, are in our own way making up for lost time. So we are increasing the funding for IS. It's just a fact of life, and to the extent, again, that we can use this as a force multiplier in keeping the number of employees to current levels and do more with technology online and through different interfaces, that I believe is where we need to be. Capital improvement program, we're still at 1% of sales tax, whereas we used to be at 0% over the last couple of, previously to the last couple of years. And our goal is to get it to at least 2%, which would be about $700,000 a year that we would allocate to either savings for future projects or allocate to capital improvement projects per the council's direction. Ideally, this number goes up to 5 to maybe even 10% in better years and better times. Baseline expenditures, we hold those to a 0.75% annual increase. So, finally.
Excuse me, does that CIP include GWP, or is it?
No, all general fund CIP. Just general fund. So this is what we look like. All of our resources for the coming years are here, starting with 14-15 at almost $173 million general fund. You can see the increase on the projections contained in our 5-year forecast that I had highlighted just a second ago, up to $206.3 million. All of our appropriations, again, based on all of the assumptions I just outlined, you see baseline expenses, PERS, significant climb here in 16-17, and that continues up until the plateau years of 2021, 21, 22. The CIP ISFs are COPs, the certificates of participation for the police building. You see that that's programmed in, and you see that OPEB is programmed in, beginning in 15-16, 800,000, a million, 1.3, 1.5, and so on throughout. So this line is our total appropriations that we are forecasting. Here is the net deficit that you see. A net deficit of 1.7 million in 14-15, growing to a maximum of 5.5 million, and then you see the easing take place that really tracks along with those PERS numbers. I will submit to you that these numbers, if you added them all up and matched them against the slide that Mr. Elliott showed you previously regarding the general fund reserve, the general fund reserve could cover all of those deficits. You have saved money over these last years, put it away for a rainy day, and it continues to rain. And so if we wanted to sustain the same level of operations and not change the organization, theoretically you could do it without cutting anything. Not our recommendation, of course, but I point that out because the fact that you had the diligence to sock that money away does give you flexibility. Yes, sir.
So now, PERS keeps escalating until fiscal year 2021-22, and I mean, yes, escalating in a significant way. And then when I'm looking at the net surplus, we appear to have an easing of the deficit from a high of 5.5 million in 18-19 to 1.5 million in 21-22. And this easing comes at the expense of higher total appropriations?
Comes at the expense of the appropriations. The PERS rate is flattening out.
And revenue growth.
And the revenue is on a straight line that continues to grow.
The PERS rate's flattening out, but nevertheless, in absolute numbers, it's a far larger number than compared to 2018-19. So it is the appropriations, right?
It is the appropriations.
And what are the total appropriations going up? At what expense are they? How are we generating higher appropriations?
If we go back to, we are putting money into our ISFs, so workers' comp. We need to do that. We need to put money into fleet. We need to put money into ISF or into IS department. We need to. We are continuing. We aspire to increase the CIP in the general fund to 2% of sales tax. Our baseline expenditures we are increasing by 0.75. So all those, and also this is without a salary increase beyond that which was negotiated with GFFA for 15-16 or 15-16. So what you see is this is just our growth in revenues, 2.4% year-over-year growth, and those appropriations, the baseline is growing by 0.75%. PERS is growing based on the rate structure that we have and the anticipated rates that we have. CIP is going from 1%, migrating up a quarter of a percent a year to 2% of sales tax. The ISFs are growing by those amounts that I had indicated just a second ago. The COPs are relatively static in terms of 500,000, then they jump to 8, then they jump to $1 million as we ramp up, and that's to pay the debt service on the police headquarters building. And then OPEB, this number, it's an interesting number because at this point in time we have to book, we have to calculate OPEB in a couple years. We'll have to actually book it on our balance sheet. So if we are to continue on status quo, then we believe we need to start putting that money away, or the liabilities will overwhelm our balance sheet.
Okay, I think I sort of didn't phrase myself appropriately. These are all amounts that we will be appropriating to properly fund all these things, right? Okay, and at some point, year 21, 22, we're going to be hopefully appropriating $207.8 million. My question is, where does that money come from? Where is the increase from 174.5 for next fiscal year versus 207.8 million 2021-22 come from? The balance. Where is the additional appropriation coming from?
Of cost? It's in these items right here, sir.
No. I know. I understand the cost. I mean, we're funding it from somewhere. Where's the money coming from?
Which slide is that? We are predicting property tax. The average growth in the general fund revenues, all in, 2.4 per year through 21-22.
And which slide is that? I'm sorry.
That is slide number 28.
28. Thank you.
So property tax will continue on it is a conservative number, but it is not a pessimistic number. So we're not trying to sandbag. We believe 3.1. Sales tax, 4.6. Utility user tax, very minimal. That follows and tracks along with the current rate plans at 1.5% increase in revenue. Building permits, 5.2, which is a reduction from what we've seen in this boom of building. The other licenses, permits, charges for service, and a continued reduction in the electric transfer, the electric general fund transfer, $250,000 per year to get to that floor of 10% and then lock it in there. Pursuant to council direction.
And these assumptions are based on historical information?
All of our historical information.
Okay. Thank you.
So we have been... We have been
data mining.
Yeah, we've been conservative, but we have not been pessimistic.
Okay, thank you.
Question, if I could. On the OPEB, I mean, there's a lot of factors in there that are very fluid, such as life expectancy of the retiree, such as healthcare costs in general, such as the type of plan that the city offers. Presumably, the city could offer everyone the HMO plan, and those retirees would have a much less blended subsidy due to blending than the PPO plan.
Certainly.
So is this the proper accounting method to deal with this? Because there's just so many. I mean, it's certainly as variable as traditional salaries and benefits and things like that. We could, at some point, we could decide to increase the pension benefits on our own course.
Sure.
In which case, there's certainly no line in there because it's unknown. So I'm not. I mean, I understand you have to deal with it somehow, but to start putting away money out of the budget, creating a deficit. I guess I question whether that is the best practice for accounting.
You're absolutely right, sir. Because and the idea here is to effectively show you the ghost of Christmas future. If you did nothing different than what you do today, these are the assumptions, and this is what we're recommending to you. But you're absolutely right. You could say, you know what? No, this is basically we'll note it on our balance sheet. And the bond underwriters, the investment community, every other city is going to be in the same boat. So let's just not put that money away. You could do that, and that wouldn't be wholly unreasonable. Make no mistake. However, we're saying that if you be 800,000, a million, 1.3, it drops in the bucket compared to that 214. So you do have a tremendous amount of flexibility. You could come back and say, you know what, maybe we shouldn't put any more money into the CIP. Heaven forbid we get grants from the feds or the state to do that work. All this is designed strictly as a model for you to gauge where we are today and where you think you might want to tack to as we read the winds.
Can I ask a question along the same lines? This is assuming the same number of employees we have today?
At the same number of employees without increasing their cost, other than the PERS.
No assumption of increasing employees, no assumption of decreasing.
At 1588, that's correct.
So when we negotiate with our unions and they agree to pick up part of the healthcare cost increase, does that negotiated amount also extend to our retirees?
I'm sorry, say it again, sir?
So we sit down with an employee group and we say 50% of any increase, we're going to ask your membership to contribute. Mm-hmm. Does that same negotiated amount apply to the retirees?
No, because they're retired. They're not covered by that MOU.
So they have no share in any cost increase.
They pay the entire amount. They're just getting a lower rate from the subsidization.
If it goes up, their rates go up.
Right.
If the insurance goes up,
they're just not, exactly, they're not participating in the 50-50 split of increase the way our current employees are.
We're not contributing anything.
That's my point, is that we are not doing a traditional retiree medical program where the city is laying out cash every month for these employees for their medical insurance. The benefit that you are granting them, such as it is to allow them to buy insurance through the city and to blend the rates with the currents and the retirees.
And just so the public has some idea, and I have some idea, you are a single person, 50 years old, maybe you're 60, approximately, what are you paying?
Depends on your plan.
So what's the range?
The range on an HMO, I defer to Matt Doyle. If Matt's here, it would be on a Kaiser, I'm going to guess, single player? Or single person? $600 a month, up to maybe $1,700 a month?
Members of the council, yeah. Roughly on the low end, maybe $400 a month, up to maybe $600, depending on the plan.
And so a family of 3, approximately.
If there's a retiree, that would be quite rare amongst our retiree pool to have dependents, child dependents, but it could be.
Right, so a family of 2.
Family of 2 would be closer to $1,000, $1,200, and a full family with dependents could be $1,500, $1,600 a month.
Okay, so just so the public understands, these retirees are paying quite a bit out of pocket, probably
Absolutely.
comparable to what somebody now in the insurance exchanges would be paying.
Certainly. And again, you are not giving them a cash contribution to either matching or to offset that in any way, whereas a lot of agencies historically have. And there still are a number of agencies that continue to do that, and how they do that remains a mystery.
Okay, and it doesn't escape me that this is a can of worms that we're dancing around at this point. But how is that benefit afforded? In what way is it memorialized, and is it agreed? Is it an ordinance? Is it a charter? Is it part of the employee agreements? How is that done?
I believe it's featured. It is not in the charter. It's featured in the MOUs.
No, it's
not even the MOUs.
The only method it's memorialized is in our MOUs, which affect active employees, and it indicates that at retirement they'd be eligible to remain on the plan, and it doesn't say which plan. It doesn't say what the parameters are, and that's something
we should straighten out as we're setting aside a $250 million OPEB liability. I certainly, whichever way we go, want to be a little more firm on the ground that we stand and the employees and the retirees stand, rather than a vague reference to participating in a health plan.
And indeed, I think until GASB, I forget which standard had come out, that we didn't even have to account for it. We didn't have to calculate it. It was simply a pay-as-you-go. And we knew that there was a subsidization going on, but when the standard changed and we have to calculate it, and then when the standard comes again and forces it to list it on the balance sheet, then it has to become very real very quick for you. And as you indicate, knowing what the legal authority is and knowing that the courts are already fighting this out right now. There was a pretty significant case coming out of Orange County, I believe, last year that dealt with this. All of these things, and healthcare reform adding into the mix, all these things are coming together, but they do have a very real impact on our budget going forward. So definitely we want to make sure we introduce and frame the topic and set the stage for the council to have those policy discussions. The last thing I want to share with you here is very important, and it could derail everything that we are telling you. That is basically the GRA loan repayment. As you know, in the early days, the city had loaned the redevelopment agency money to get started and do the good work of redevelopment in Glendale. And those loans had been carried over and rolled forward pursuant to the way that redevelopment was done to make sure that you had debt that would justify the continued payment of tax increment from the redevelopment property taxes that were, or the tax increment that was being collected from the redevelopment project area. When the state last, or year before last, ended redevelopment, they struck all of the loans, bona fide agreements between the city and its redevelopment agency. We had valued those loans at $72 million. The state came back and said, no, you have to calculate them a different way. That knocked the value down into the 60s. They have since come back and argued again that they should be calculated on yet a different interest rate. We believe that that number probably is closer to $45 million, even using their numbers. That said, we have a letter from the state of California that says, actually, we have decided to discount it yet a different way, not contained in the statute, and that we believe administratively on orders from the governor's office that the value of your loan is zero. Not half, not $1, but zero. Our team has gone to Sacramento to meet and confer with the Department of Finance. We have had second and third and fourth opinions on this that would indicate that they are entirely in the wrong, because on the one hand they've struck down the loan agreements but then held them out as a carrot for agencies to do their good work in winding up the redevelopment agency. We've done that. We've gotten the notice of completion. We've played ball at every turn, and the bait and switch is the loan that was supposed to be the carrot has now become a stick. So we may end up, after we exhaust any remedies, if they remain intransigent, look to council to authorize the filing of a lawsuit, because as you can see, this amount of money, this loan repayment, and keep in mind we had been repaying the city from the agency $7 million a year, even at 1.2, 1.8, 4.7. If all of this does get struck, then we are at this number. If it doesn't get struck, if we're able to sustain it, we are looking at $500,000 deficit, $2 million deficit, less than $1 million as we go, just over 1.1 million, and then we turn into surpluses out in these out years again as the easing takes place. All that said, the bright shiny day that is here by any account in 2021, we have to get through that dark night of the soul in these years. That is difficult because we don't want to chew off the paw that we will need later on. And so when we look at our 5-year forecast, it's the story of the good, the bad, and the ugly. We're stable, we're progressive, and we are approaching that structural balance, especially as we tackle that OPEB number and continue to make good on all of the cost-sharing agreements for our pension obligations. We've weathered the fiscal storm, and we are getting back to pre-recessionary levels. To the extent that we have the bad, there's no new programming, as you saw. There's no new personnel, and in fact, you run the risk of losing key personnel as we wade through this long slog. The ugly is the state of California, and whether or not they will take that loan repayment, or if they'll just leave us alone, or if they will continue to add still more burden on us by way of ill-fated bills or ill-conceived bills like AB 109 that puts more quote-unquote nonviolent criminals back out on the street. Yes, ma'am.
The state of California, Sacramento has been bragging a lot lately about being in surplus. In fact, they have a ridiculous amount of surplus dollars.
18 billion, I believe.
If people are wondering where a lot of that's come from, it's come from the budget of this city and other cities. It's come directly from the money that goes for this city to pay for public safety, parks, all manner of services. As we've just heard, they have literally stolen that money from the pocket of the city of Glendale, the city of Burbank, all of the cities around the state. And the fact that they're sitting on that money now, not knowing what to do with it, is really something the public should pay attention to and ask them, how much money have you taken from these cities and what are you doing with it? And do you plan to give it back? Because this is a scam, so that a way for them to balance their budget, and they not only balanced it, but they took so much money that they're sitting around saying, boy, we don't know what to do with this money. Let's create some more programs that nobody wants. Let's spend some more money. And all of the cities are struggling, and I think you're going to see city after city go into bankruptcy if this doesn't stop over the next couple of years. We've already seen a few of them, and we're going to start seeing more of them. And why is it happening? Is it because they were irresponsible? In some cases, but in many cases it's directly related to what Sacramento's been doing.
All that said, we have before you, based on this 5-year projection, a couple of options, and one is to maintain the status quo. And as I say, that is something that is very safe because we know what the status quo looks like and feels like. Our customers and businesses and stakeholders know what that is. Our employees know what's expected of them. But again, it means that there's no new programming, and in fact, we are freezing the cost of those employees on a going forward basis. Further, as you look at, I can't say it enough, when you look at the projected deficits, these are all relatively manageable deficits that you could muddle through, so to speak, year after year after year. It isn't the 15 million, the 18 million, the 10 million that we took on from 09, 10, 11, and then 12. We were able to weather those storms. So the idea being that if we can maintain all of our performance ratios, all of our performance indicators, we know that we can capitalize and convert on that value proposition. The downside is, again, the employee morale of folks could decline further. People have been doing a great job for a number of years, and as people in the private sector, in our community most certainly have. But the idea being that as we look over the fence at other organizations, other entities who may not be as diligent as what the city council has been, you could see that morale decline, and with it, performance and execution. Being at a competitive disadvantage to attract new folks to come into the organization. And again, no new programming. The alternative to that status quo, and again, there's nothing wrong with that status quo, is option 2. Option 2 would be a continued reorganization of the city of Glendale that could revolve around incentives for folks to voluntarily leave the organization. We would have to look at what that means to our civil service system, and to the extent that we may want to revise and reform some of the onerous burdens contained within that system. But the idea being that we would hold positions vacant for as long as we could, and really as a function of what the cost of the incentive could ultimately be, understanding that it would have to be met and conferred upon with our employee associations, recognizing that the associations have been tremendous partners heretofore. When you think of the PERS cost sharing, one thing that other agencies have started to do now that Glendale kind of set the trend, whereas you negotiated in good faith with your associations to simply increase or to implement and then increase cost sharing on the employer side of the PERS equation, what other cities have started to do is, because they didn't have their employees paying any portion of the employee, not the employer, but the employee share of PERS, they have started to give increases to those employees, and then turn around and have those employees actually begin to pay the employee share and sometimes the employer share of the PERS obligation. What this means to us is that we are falling further behind what that market average is, and one thing that we could do is take a page out of that book to increase the compensation to the classifications pursuant to meet and confer negotiations, and at the same time immediately take those increases back. So I would pay you 2%, take 2%, and apply that to PERS cost sharing. What that does, you say, well, what good does that do? There is inherent benefit to the employees, certainly, in doing that, and there is benefit to the organization by way of keeping current with the market. as well as making sure that we, again, lead the way on pension reform. And then lastly, develop and implement an OPEB strategy. Not sure what that ultimately would look like, but the council will have to weigh heavy into it. And we hope that in developing and implementing that strategy that is fair for all the folks who currently are with us, all the people that have given us their careers, and at the same time mitigate what the future increases could be, both for actives and retirees. When we talk about that finding a new path, the goals, I think the pros are, as I indicated, but the cons, the major con, the antithesis of option one is that it's uncertain. We don't know, depending on what's ultimately negotiated with the unions, we don't know who would take us up on that alternative. And so the idea of understanding what the impact would be still would be uncertain because we would have to move forward in partnership with them. To the extent that we would reorganize departments and personnel, as you saw in our employee survey, the notion of favoritism as a reflection of prioritization, kind of where you stand depends on where you sit, and we would have to wrestle and communicate. We had to wrestle with that particular dynamic and communicate very clearly with all of our employees. And the notion that we would be doing as much through collaboration and networks, while it sounds good, is very difficult to achieve because the volatility and the control, the less control that you have in that network environment provide for a somewhat difficult opportunity to give assurance to our customers and to our partners. Those are the options that we see based on the upcoming budgets as we look out into the future. At this point, just to refocus us on 14-15, Bob will give you a very brief overview of the upcoming fiscal year. Bob?
Thanks, Scott. Before I dive into that, I would be remiss if I didn't thank all the staff, my budget staff, Jason Bradford and folks, and all the budget liaisons that worked a lot of hours putting this preliminary budget together. So thank you, everyone. So diving into 14-15, we've talked a lot about what has been built into the previous budgets and within our forecast, but to get more specific, as Scott said, just to highlight some of the changes in the specific accounts like property tax and sales tax and what our relative increases are that we have built in for this year. Property tax, we're looking at about a 3.8%, and sales tax about a 5.6% increase. Building permits, I mentioned that earlier. Looking at 13-14, we're expecting about a 7.7% increase relative to last year, 13-14's original estimate. It's actually a little bit lower than what our ultimate will be in 13-14. The overall revenues, again, for 14-15 are about 2.5%, and some of the other changes that we have made are shown here, the UUT and franchise fees. And again, that has a reduction built in of $250,000 on the electric transfer as we trend that down over time. Highlighting the salary and benefit increases, about $2.7 million. Again, there's no COLA built in or assumed in this budget other than the GFFA cost sharing increase that we have built in. PERS increases, we've talked at $1.7 million, but there is an offset with the cost sharing with the individual groups. As we mentioned previously, the increase in the workers' comp, trying to get that fund completely out of deficit over 8 years. It's approximately $16.8 million deficit now. We're trying to get that worked out and managing claims as we move forward. We do have some increases in our medical, dental, vision. That's built in and pretty much constant with the other benefits. In the maintenance and operations, there's an increase in total of about $710,000. The majority of that is with the fleet and some other contractual obligations. There's other things that are going up and down with some reductions in ISD charges for this year moving forward. Within the general fund, we are moving to start funding the debt service for the certificates of participation. As you recall, we restructured that loan last year away from what we had previously done. It's now tagged to the LIBOR 70% of the LIBOR rate plus 40 basis points. It's still well below 2% in terms of what we're being charged. The bad news is we still owe $44 million for the costs of building the police station. So we need to start funding that. We have cash set aside in our debt service fund, but it's not enough to ultimately extinguish the debt over time. Some of the other highlights, we have the 1% of sales tax for CIP moving out of the general fund. We have a slight increase in nutritional meals for that program. We have economic development has shifted out of the general fund to a new fund, Fund 215, as we move that operation to its own cost center. Lastly, we have, these are all the recurring changes. We have two non-recurring changes. One is, Scott talked about the information technology, putting $2 million aside for the technology data center upgrade. That's a one-time cost, and then another one-time cost for $5 million for the central library renovation. Again, this is basically a recap. We're starting with our baseline revenues of $170 million and working through all those different adjustments as we move forward with the various ins and outs of the budget, getting us down to a $174 million in total revenue. Small use of fund balance to get us to a $174.5 million resource. And then with the total use of $2 million for the data center upgrade and $5 million, these are one time again with total appropriation of $181 million or $181 million in resources needed. On the appropriations side, again, as we have broken down into the increases, salary and benefits of $1.2 million, the ISF rate changes, the ups and downs of that of almost $2 million. Some of the changes in the maintenance and operations capital outlay of $530. Again, that gets us to that balanced figure of $174 million. And then the two one-time uses of fund balance for the general fund. What would that end up looking like? Here's our recurring amounts. There's the small use of fund balance, the $495,000, the one-time use of $5 million for the library, $2 million for the data center. For total, we would be using or projecting to use $7.4 million, $5 million in fund balance. So in doing so, we start with our projected fund balance at $61 million, taking out that 7.5, getting this down to $53 million, 53.6, still above our floor of 30% and 30.7%, assuming all these numbers are fully spent.
So by way of conclusion, certainly we'll open up for questions with council and direction from council. We do remain operationally balanced. As you saw in that 5-year financial forecast, we do have reliance upon either one-time savings, our use of fund balance, and or general fund reserve, and or the GRA loan repayment. So we remain a healthy ongoing concern, but we know that structurally we still have some work to do. As Bob had indicated, the projected general fund deficit, less than $500,000, could be resolved, as foreshadowed above, the idea of doing personnel actions by way of freezing current recruitments or looking at other options that might exist pursuant to meet and confer use of fund balance or even program cuts, stop doing some programs that we currently offer. But all those are short-term fixes, and those would represent the future presented by option one. Muddling along, maintaining the status quo, and taking on these rather small deficits as they come in each year. Or we can adopt an organization strategy revolving around targeted reductions in investments, and that would really revolve around option two and profile option two. The idea here is to balance the market dynamic with our ability to pay and still provide some flexibility within the organization to make sure that we have the right people, the right places doing the right job for the long term. We are recommending to you option two, as I said previously, and it's not a soft sell or the idea that option one is very much doable. We can live in that status quo, and most of our competition indeed is. However, if we are able to look at some of the changes, if we can get agreement and concurrence with our associations, we think that that gives us the flexibility to make some investments long-term in the organization. So if the council were to go this direction versus option one, we would commence immediately meet and confer negotiations with our associations and unions, and we would be trying to calibrate those to our budget calendar. As you see today, the 29th, we have our upcoming budget study session number 2 that focuses on council priorities, the summary of appropriations, and the departmental budgets that mirror, kind of cascade from what the council's priorities are, and how those are reflected in what the outcomes are that really tell the story of the work that we're doing. With respect to budget study session number 3, we look historically at fees and charges, CIP, and we also focus on GWP. This is a bit of a change with the calendar such as it is. We are hoping to actually do our budget hearing on May the 20th, the evening of May the 20th, not June the 3rd. If we are to go towards option 2, the whatever that ultimately looks like, this really becomes something of a 2-year budget as we sort out what the alterations and adjustments to the organization could and would be, and ultimately what the impact is on the budget. So if we are successful in pursuing that option 2, then we really can have a rather abbreviated budget process, thus focus on May the 20th for a budget hearing and adoption on June the 3rd versus a budget hearing on June the 3rd and an adoption, I believe, on June 24th was the original schedule. But a lot of that will depend on which way the council wants to go and ultimately what the meet and confer sessions with our employee groups yield. So with that, we'd be happy to try and answer any questions. All of our department directors are here. If you have specific questions related to their department as pertains to the information you viewed, and that concludes our presentation.
Mayor?
Yes, please.
No questions right now, but I have a couple of comments. And I'm glad to see that the press is here. I hope that they have similar analysis that I've had after listening to this very comprehensive and excellent presentation. And thank you to staff, Mr. Elliott, Mr. Cho, and everybody else who were involved. Certainly over the last several years, the city has faced really increasing challenges in terms of finances. We've seen realignment shift a lot of the responsibilities ostensibly to the county for the prison population, but that has huge impacts on local law enforcement as they're dealing with parolees who are coming early out of prison without supervision by the state. We've had redevelopment taken away from us, and as we see now, even the loan that the state forced the city to pay for redevelopment, and that was how it was set up to pay for. The state said, here's the rules. You sell a bond, you take out a loan, and then we'll pay it back out of the sales tax. We're going to let that out of property tax. We're going to let that come back to the cities. And then, now that you've taken this huge loan, we're not going to let you pay it back through the property taxes we had promised years ago. So it's really unprecedented pressures. We've seen salaries and benefits, the cost for that increase over the years. So it has been a real challenge. Meanwhile, our employee groups have been our partners in this. They have taken increasing cost sharing onto their shoulders. They have allowed us to not give them COLAs over the past 5 years, so they've seen basically the amount they're paying out of pocket increase without getting any of that money back while inflation's been increasing. And we've been downsizing the city workforce significantly, so all of those remaining employees have to work harder to deliver the same excellent services to the community that the community expects. It's interesting. I went to one of the candidate forums, and the way that the candidates speak, and I know a lot of it is because, if you're not really in the trenches, you have a different perspective when you're on the outside, but they talk as though there's piles of cash lying around to fund all kinds of programs. Certainly, there are valid programs that residents ask for, like having more crossing guards around the schools, better maintenance of parks, all sorts of things that we'd like to do. But I hope that those people and those candidates are watching to see how challenging the budget is and how tight the money is. And on the flip side, how lean the city is, how little waste there is. We go through the budget, and next week we'll go through the departments, and you'll see that there really is not huge amounts of waste out there that we can tackle. There's not extra money lying around for all of these programs. It's been difficult, and yet we have maintained, I believe, excellent services to the community with decreasing revenue, decreasing employees. That's a testament to the employees who work so hard and who are so dedicated. It's a testament to the city manager and his office that they're able to squeeze more and more out of this dry turnip. I don't know if that's a real metaphor, I just made that up. But you get the idea. We still are a full functioning city with one of the safest cities in the country, with an excellent fire department, a lot of things the residents can be proud of, excellent parks. We continue to build parks, and there's less and less money and less employees. So the take-home message that I'm hoping the press hears, I'm hoping the public hears, is that it's been challenging, it's been difficult, and we are really doing our best to deal with that, and I think that the public has not felt the impact of a huge amount of revenue reduction that we've experienced over the past several years. There are not pots of money lying around. If there's a huge amount of waste, please, somebody come forward and show it to us, because I think everyone in this room would love to see what that is and find a way to deal with that so that we can put that money to better use. It's going to continue to be challenging, as we saw. I hope the state works with us instead of against us, and we will continue to be fiscally responsible and to make this city function as we have done over the past several years.
Thank you, Ms. Friedman. Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Mr.
I
Quintero.
want to thank the city manager and Mr. Elliott, Ms. Beers, the department heads that I know have worked on it. Also want to thank T.S. Elliott for providing the
No relation.
style to. Look, I'm just really appreciative at how these budget study sessions have changed since Mr. Ochoa has taken over. I think it's concise, and specifically, I think the public now has a much better understanding of what we do and how we go about doing it and what the reality is confronting the city. But I'm optimistic. I know, I personally believe the worst is over, both the economy and the situation here in the city. I think we're in an upward trend in terms of revenues, the development that's taking place, the sales tax, et cetera. So I think we've kind of bottomed out. We still have a couple of years that are going to be difficult, especially for the employees, but I'm confident we'll be able to push through it. And I do think the second option is the way to go. There's no question that we can make some adjustments. I also think there's some people that perhaps would be interested in moving on, so to speak. So I'm very optimistic. I think we're going to be able to do it, having been here at the very top and then gone through the whole cycle of the economic recession that we entered. But I think it's coming to an end. So looking forward to the rest of the budget hearings.
Yes, Mr. Weaver.
Well, this is my 18th city budget, and for the first 10 to 15 years, we had budgets, as I recall. There wasn't a lot of extra money, but people wanted more things, and we found ways to fund them. The crossing guards, school resource officers, libraries open more. We found ways to do this because we had enough money and were willing to go into increase our transfers from $10 million to $20 million in a 10-year period. We did a lot of things because we thought, or we knew we had the money at the time. It's just like in 2000, 2001, where we first said we were super funded and glory days are ahead of us. 10 years later, where are we sitting? Just the opposite. It's a new day. Based on all things Ms. Friedman said about what Sacramento's done to us, that's not going to change. The way I look at it, if the state can work it someday, they'll take over the running of all the cities and we'll just stay home, let the state run us. But with the way things are now, the public, all the residents, all the businesses, all those employees got to realize there's not going to be any big heyday of more money. I can see no source of great additional funding coming into the city from any place. Even when we asked the residents about 3 different measures to put on the ballot, the one that still gets me is the TOT, the Transit Occupancy Tax, where it wouldn't cost the taxpayers $1 single. It'd be paid for by visitors into the city. The public voted it down. If the public is not going to want $1 single of taxes, if they increase, and if they were to try to vote down the utility tax and vote the transfer out, we might as well fold up and go away because the revenue stream isn't there. You're not going to be able to create enough new businesses in this town. I was at that forum too, and everybody's talking about, oh, we'll bring in small businesses. Bunk. That ain't going to do it. So where is the gigantic new source of revenue coming from? We're not going to be able to build another Brand Boulevard of cars, another Americana, another Galleria. That isn't going to happen. So where's all the revenue going to come from when you have the state and the federal government, whatever, taking grant money away or taxes away, whatever, and then leave us with the problem of asking the residents to pay more in taxes to backfill what the state and feds have done and having them say, well, we don't want to do it. Everybody has got to realize it's a new day. It's going to be tough on everybody, the residents and the employees. The foreseeable future. We try to budget fiscally conservative. Mr. Cho and staff, I know Bob Elliott's staff worked to 9:30 at night a lot of times trying to get everything done. They put a lot of work in. I think we're getting an honest appraisal of where we're heading in the future. I just hope this community will hang together and allow us to do, as a council, what we have to do to continue to give this community the services they deserve and the recognition we're getting across the board for what we have done and can continue to do. So I think I may be with Mr. Quintero and maybe the others at least looking at option 2 and see what we got to do, because it's a new day in this city. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Weaver. And I also want to join my colleagues and thank staff for preparing this budget report. I want to specifically thank Scott Ochoa and his team for not doing the easy thing and comfortable thing and just merely saying, hey, listen, we're probably going to be okay. Let's trudge along and hope for the best. And recognizing that the road ahead may be perilous. There are significant budgetary challenges ahead of us with PERS, and there's the uncertainty of a couple of lawsuits ahead of us also. And look at all the alternatives that are out there, at least consider them, think of ways to cut any fat to the extent there's any fat left. And again, even that's up to discussion. So let's do the safe thing. Let's be safe and responsible in considering our city's budget and finances on a forward-going basis. And do we have a motion to note and file the report?
So moved.
Second.
Can we have roll call, please?
Yes.
Najarian, Quintero,
Yes.
Weaver,
Aye.
Mayor Sinanian.
Yes.
Move to
And
adjourn?
we have a resolution appropriating
Oh, yeah, the 340,000.
the funding necessary for the
So
adjustment
moved.
budget aside.
So moved.
Second.
Can we have roll call, please?
Councilmembers Friedman,
Yes.
Najarian,
Yes.
Quintero,
Yes.
Weaver,
Aye.
Mayor Sinanian.
Yes.
I'll move to adjourn.
Yes. Second?
Second.
Now we're adjourned.